Okay, so I know that I just made a video about how we need to stop making videos about how Tolkien hated stuff, but this is a conversation I've been meaning to have for a while because it's something that gets brought up in almost every discussion about The Lord of the Rings and its deeper significance. This is, of course, the claim that J.R.R. Tolkien hated allegory. And there is a simple way to take that claim, but if you're willing to dig a little deeper with me today, it can open up a dialogue about who Tolkien was as a person and as an artist, the history of Tolkien's scholarship, and the abilities and limitations of fantasy as an art form. Let's begin with the simplest possible question: did Tolkien actually hate allegory? And the answer can be found in the foreword of the second edition of The Lord of the Rings. There Tolkien wrote, "I cordially dislike allegory in all its manifestations, and have always done so since I grew old and wary enough to detect its presence." He would claim in later letters, "There is no symbolism or conscious allegory in my story." So that seems pretty cut and dry, right? Tolkien disliked allegory and he didn't use it. Simple. It's never actually simple with Tolkien though, because for someone who said he didn't like it and didn't use it, Tolkien seems to use allegory an awful lot in his stories. The Oxford English Dictionary defines allegory as a story, picture, etc., which uses symbols to convey a hidden or ulterior meaning. By that definition, I think you can absolutely claim that The Lord of the Rings is allegorical. It uses signs and symbols of fantasy, kings, queens, magical rings, in order to convey an ulterior meaning. Themes about love, war, loss, pain, you name it, someone's written a think piece about it. But that's not even the only example of Tolkien using allegory. His short stories like Smith of Wootton Major, Mr. Bliss, Roverandom, and especially Leaf by Niggle can clearly handle an allegorical reading. I mean, come on, you've got a perfectionistic artist who's obsessed with trees. You can't tell me that's not like a little bit autobiographical. And if that's not convincing enough for you, let's take a look at his essay Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics, where he specifically, at multiple points, says, "I am about to use an allegory," and then he allegorizes. Fun fact, if you take a drink every time I say allegory in this video, by the end of it, you'll actually be able to pick Tolkien's brain about this question face to face, because you will have joined him in the next realm. So Tolkien disliked allegory, and he claimed not to use it, but we have clear evidence that he did use it, sometimes on purpose. So what gives? In order to unravel this mess, we're gonna have to take a closer look at what Tolkien meant by allegory. You see, he was a very particular man with very particular opinions, especially when it came to words and their meaning. We can get a little more context about this if we take a look at a larger chunk of that quote from the second edition of The Lord of the Rings. "But I cordially dislike allegory in all its manifestations, and have always done so since I grew old and wary enough to detect its presence. I much prefer history, true or feigned, with its varied applicability to the thought and experience of readers. I think that many confuse applicability with allegory, but one resides in the freedom of the reader, and the other in the purposed domination of the author." Now, if we throw on our nuance glasses here, it's not hard to see that Tolkien isn't just saying allegory bad, authors who use allegory bad. These are my nuance glasses, by the way, and they're from this video's sponsor, Warby Parker. Warby Parker is dedicated to helping you get the glasses that you need. They have an online shop, retail locations, and they design all their frames in-house. They have everything from prescription glasses to sunglasses to contacts, with all of their glasses starting at just $95, including prescription lenses. With their free home try-on program, you can order 5 pairs of glasses to try at home for free, and there's no obligation to buy. And shipping for that is free too, including a prepaid return shipping label. I was able to take their home try-on quiz, which asks questions about fit and style preferences, and they gave me lots of excellent recommendations for glasses I might like. I got all of these fabulous glasses, and let me show you a few. First off, we have the aforementioned nuance glasses, which I like. They're super cute. They're really lightweight, but they feel very sturdy, and they make me feel like I'm a Victorian librarian, which I always want to feel like. And then of course, I got lots of sunglasses too. I love me a funky little pair of sunglasses. I mean, I wear them pretty much every time I step outside, and all of the ones Warby Parker sent me fit my style and my face really well. You can try on 5 pairs of glasses at home for free using this QR code right here or the link in my video description. Plus, if you have vision benefits when you're getting ready to buy, you can use your vision insurance or your flexible spending account on prescription glasses, contacts, and eye exams. From designer quality glasses and contacts to eye exams and vision tests, Warby Parker has got you and your eyeballs covered. Thank you so much to Warby Parker for sponsoring this video. Be sure to check them out in the description, and thanks to all of you for checking out my sponsors when I have them. Tolkien's definition of allegory consisted of equations. Every individual element of a story must directly equate with some symbolic meaning, and all of these elements within the story and within the proposed meaning must mesh together to create an entirely whole, logically consistent allegory. There was no wishy-washiness permitted, no alternate interpretations, no multiple interpretations for each item. And by this very restrictive definition, I think Tolkien was perfectly fair saying that The Lord of the Rings is not allegorical. For example, he said that the War of the Ring could not be correlated to the Second World War. He said that the One Ring was not allegorical for the atomic bomb, and he said that the Scouring of the Shire had nothing to do with the state of England post-World War II, even though a lot of people read those interpretations in the story and got a lot out of that allegorical meaning. His reasoning for why this cannot be allegorical is because if it was an allegory, the story would have turned out very differently. They would have used the One Ring against Sauron, and instead of killing him in the end, they would have taken him prisoner. He believes that if this really was an allegory, Saruman would have survived, and he would have gone on to build an even more powerful ring, and everything would fall into chaos. It's very bleak. These wars might seem kind of parallel. England and the Shire might have some similarities. The ring might be able to be compared to the atomic bomb, but because the follow-through of his story is so different from the follow-through of the real-world war, Tolkien believes that it did not hold as an allegory. He offers the condolence of applicability, saying that, you know, people are free to take bits here and there and interpret them how they wish, but the intent was expressly not allegorical and had nothing to do with these real-world events. This was an opinion that he came to through time and that grew stronger as he grew older, and I believe that it was, at least in part, due to the growing popularity of The Lord of the Rings. If we take a look at some of Tolkien's earlier letters, before The Lord of the Rings had grown to the wild popularity it eventually saw, we can see that his opinions on allegory and The Lord of the Rings were much more mild. In 1947, he wrote to Stanley Unwin, addressing his son's reception of the first book, which he had just proofread. "Do not let Rayner suspect allegory. There is a moral, I suppose, in any tale worth telling, but that is not the same thing. Of course, allegory and story converge, meeting somewhere in truth, so that the only perfectly consistent allegory is real life, and the only fully intelligible story is an allegory. You can make the ring into an allegory of our own time if you like, an allegory of the inevitable fate that waits for all attempts to defeat evil power by power, but that is only because all power, magical or mechanical, does always so work." As you can see, this is a bit more of a gentle take. He even admits that you can form these allegories, except that they're most useful speaking on universal truths. In 1951, he wrote, "I dislike allegory, the conscious and intentional allegory, yet any attempt to explain the purport of myth or fairy tale must use allegorical language." These more mild approaches continued until The Lord of the Rings saw a massive spike in popularity in the 60s. It's then that we start seeing more aggressive responses to people's assertions that The Lord of the Rings was allegorical for the modern day. There is no symbolism or conscious allegory in my story. Allegory of the sort that the 5 wizards equals the 5 senses is wholly foreign to my way of thinking. There were 5 wizards, and that is just a unique part of history. To ask if the orcs are communists is to me as sensible as asking if communists are orcs. I have no didactic purpose and no allegorical intent. I do not like allegory, properly so called. Most readers appear to confuse it with significance or applicability, but that is a matter too long to deal with here. I really liked the use of the parentheses inside of the parentheses in that one, very stylish, but he got really worked up in response to the introduction to the Swedish translation of The Lord of the Rings, which asserted that Sauron was allegorical for Stalin. I utterly repudiate any such reading, which angers me. The situation was conceived long before the Russian Revolution. Such allegory is entirely foreign to my thought. It was around this time, in 1965, that the second edition of The Lord of the Rings came out, with its very strong claims against allegorical intent. And I think at this point, it's fair to say that Tolkien was just over it. He was sick of people imposing their allegorical concepts over his story, sick of people wringing the story out to try and eke out every last drop of possible meaning. He was sick of people overanalyzing something that was, at its heart, meant to be enjoyable escapist fantasy. And the thing is that this whole conversation comes down to semantics and taste, which is something that we'll get into a bit later, but it is worth examining why people were pushing so hard to analyze and intellectualize Middle-earth, especially when Tolkien was so diametrically opposed to it. From our modern perspective, it's easy to forget that whilst fantasy has become fairly readily accepted as being deep and intellectual in its own right, that was not the case 70 years ago when Tolkien was publishing The Lord of the Rings. For a long time, fantasy suffered under the constraints of academia, which saw its blatantly unreal stories and its lean towards escapism as making it children's literature, or at best, cheap thrills genre fiction. In many of the more lofty circles of academia, The Lord of the Rings was being dismissed as juvenile trash, as popcorn reading, entirely severed from reality, and thus void of meaning. There was no applicability readings for them, no, it was allegory or nothing. Of course, most of the people who read The Lord of the Rings that didn't have their heads stuck up their own incredibly academic could see that this opinion was, at best, uncharitable, and at worst, ignorant. The Lord of the Rings gets to some incredibly deep themes, the profound battle between good and evil, transcendent hope and loss. It's all of Tolkien's philosophical musings from his lifetime distilled into one story. So, in order to combat this juvenile, meaningless trash narrative, fans and sympathizers pushed way the other way, picking the story apart, analyzing everything they could, desperately trying to go, look, this does mean something. But it is possible that these efforts went a little bit too far. Conventional thought of the time seemed to view things as a binary, a two-sided sliding scale. On the one end was factual realism, and on the other end was allegorical fiction. Academics leaned one way, and fans leaned the other. What they didn't seem to get is that Tolkien wasn't trying to function in that binary. He was trying to break the mold entirely, to reach back into the mythic past and forward into a new era of storytelling. He wanted to create something that could transcend the binary of fact and fiction and become something even more powerful. Fantasy. But this fantasy can be a very delicate thing. In On Fairy Stories, Tolkien writes, "The land of fairy story is wide and deep and high, and is filled with many things. All manner of beasts and birds are found there, shoreless seas and stars uncounted, beauty that is an enchantment and an ever-present peril, both sorrow and joy as sharp as swords. In that land a man may, perhaps, count himself fortunate to have wandered, and while he is there, it is dangerous for him to ask too many questions, lest the gates shut and the keys be lost. The fairy gold too often turns to withered leaves when it is brought away. For Tolkien, stories like The Lord of the Rings weren't meant to be ripped to pieces, to be torn to their component parts and examined at a molecular level. They're meant to be taken and viewed on the whole. Fantasy crumbles when it is taken out of the realm of the Fae, and so the magic of The Lord of the Rings is destroyed when it is put under allegorical scrutiny. By digging too far, you risk uprooting the entire tree. The Lord of the Rings does teach its own messages, but these are universal truths, not specific allegorical truths. This is where his idea of applicability comes in. He clarifies, an author cannot, of course, remain wholly unaffected by his experience, but the ways in which a story germ uses the soil of experience are extremely complex, and attempts to define the process are at best guesses from evidence that is inadequate and ambiguous. These stories aren't about Tolkien or the atomic bomb or post-war Europe. These are stories that tell universal human truths. Wherein lies their beauty? Their ambiguity, the avoidance of the exactitude of allegory, allows for the freedom of applicability. Applicability across time, space, gender, race, everything that divides us. Everyone can find something in these stories. When discussing the ways that allegory and analysis can destroy the magic of fantasy, Roger Lancelin-Green ironically allegorizes, "To seek for meaning is to cut open the ball in search of its bounce." This is the argument that Tolkien scholar Verlyn Flieger takes up in her essay, which is in response to an essay by another Tolkien scholar, Tom Shippey. In Tom Shippey's original essay, he wrote about Tolkien's short story Smith of Wootton Major, claiming that it was allegorical, and Flieger disagrees. Smith of Wootton Major, while containing some potential parallels to Tolkien's real life, is very obviously fantasy. It lives in the realm of Fae and does not need allegorical analysis in order to be enjoyable. For Flieger, fantasy is something sacred. It reaches beyond the pages in the way that no other writing can to touch on the deepest parts of the human experience. Going back to the cutting open a ball to find its bounce analogy, Flieger explains, "The power of this episode, its bounce, resides in its mystery. Smith does not understand the action of the wind or the words of the birch. He is not meant to, nor is the reader. Smith asks for no explanation, and none is forthcoming. To allegorize it is to deaden the bounce completely." She seems to side with Tolkien, believing that fairy tales, when pulled too far into the light, wither, shrivel, and disappear into the mist. The dream cannot survive in the waking hours, and so fantasy must be handled gently, viewed as applicable to the real world, but not seriously taken apart and allegorized. Of course, because these are Tolkien scholars, Flieger didn't have the last word. Shippey responded to her in the form of another essay. This source is linked with all of my other sources in the description if you want to check it out. I'll highlight it because it's honestly a really fun read, which sounds insane because it is an essay in response to an essay in response to an essay written about a pretty obscure Tolkien short story, but I figure you guys would enjoy it because you're nerds, so you might enjoy it almost as much as I did. Shippey argues that despite Tolkien's personal reservations, allegory is not the death of fantasy. Part of the most profound joy of fantasy, in fact, is taking a story apart, seeing where it came from, where it may go, what it all means. That doesn't mean you can't appreciate the story as a whole, just on its face as a story anymore. If anything, it means you can enjoy it more profoundly than you ever did before. Besides, fantasy is literature, right? And analysis of literature through an allegorical lens has sort of always been done. Shakespeare's plays aren't any less enjoyable because people have been analyzing them for hundreds of years. The stories of King Arthur don't become any less enchanting because you've taken the time to understand the context that they were written in. True art can withstand scrutiny, and to refuse to analyze Tolkien's works on a deeper level for fear of allegorizing is to miss out on some of the most beautiful depth, the facets of these stories. And I hate to say it, but Tolkien's definition of allegory is not the only way that allegory can be used. C.S. Lewis found massive success through telling stories that contained pretty overt and direct allegory. Allegory does not, as Tolkien proposed, come hand in hand with the purposed domination of the author over the will of the reader. Audiences aren't stupid. They can examine a story on its deeper levels, figure out how it was made and where it came from, and still enjoy the story on the whole. They can see the thematic direction an author might be pushing them, they can see what the allegory is meant to be, but that doesn't mean that they can't make up their own minds about it. Shippey concludes that a well and truly crafted allegory does not degrade fantasy, but enriches it. It seems to me that this is the way complex allegories work. Their life is in detail. Their texture is not gossamer, but surprisingly tough. The fear that their charm may be destroyed by too close an analysis is misplaced. They ask for careful thought, not just emotional response, because they have something serious and complex to express. Here's the thing. I am literally a Tolkien YouTuber. I have taken these books down to their component parts. I've read every page, I have pored over passages and word choices, I have flipped through every single frame of the movies. I have lifted up the rocks and seen that there's weird little bugs and stuff underneath. I have pulled back the beautiful velvet theater curtains to see the grimy cinder block walls behind them. And yet, there are still moments when I am reading the books or watching the movies where I am blown away by how much I enjoy them. Not the enjoyment of an intellectual figuring something out, but pure childlike joy and excitement. The joy I felt when I was 7 years old watching these movies for the first time, long before I ever knew what an allegory was. If an allegorical reading could destroy the magic of The Lord of the Rings, it would have been gone a long time ago. But it has stood the test of time, and its combination of fantastical magic and mystery and strong, beautifully built allegorical themes has shaped one of the most influential storytelling genres of the last millennia. In the end, it really just comes down to you. And to what you think allegory is. Are you more with Tolkien, believing that allegory is something restrictive, that it is a set in stone, this equals that framework that tears the magic away from fantasy? Or do you see allegory as yet another tool, as the multifaceted shimmer of truth, buried at the heart of even the most enchanting and enjoyable tale? In the end, it just comes down to a matter of taste, and you might be one of the people that dislikes examining stories through an allegorical lens. And if that is the case, I would love for you to tell me about your experiences with reading in the comments, because obviously, that's not how I like to examine stories, but I think there is a lot of value in letting the mystery of a story thrive. There's no right or wrong way to read a story, and that's what's so amazing about them. As I explored in my previous video about Tolkien's opinions on things, I hate to be the one to tell you this, but he's dead. And as much as his opinions and his taste are something interesting to consider, and they can add a lot of depth to examining his writing, his opinions do not dictate the entire landscape of Tolkien scholarship. It's okay to disagree with him. It's okay to like the things that he hated. It is okay to allegorize The Lord of the Rings, even if he didn't intend for it to be allegorical. Trust me, if Tolkien was gonna come back from the grave and smite anybody for overanalyzing his stories, yeah, I would have been gone a long time ago. Not that you need my permission, but if you'd like it, here it is. Enjoy literature however you want to. Analyze stories however you want to. The beauty of fantasy is in its astonishing flexibility, its allegorical applicability. You are meant to care about stories. You're meant to find meaning in them, whether that is from the bigger pictures or from the little details. It is in the flexibility of the human imagination that stories have lived and thrived since we first started talking to each other, and it is in that flexibility that they will continue to survive in ages to come. Like I said, I would love to hear some alternative perspectives in the comments. I myself am a perpetual overanalyzer, but I know that not everybody operates like that, so I would love to hear how you read and enjoy stories. Lately, I've been having a lot of fun doing these essays kind of meta style about Tolkien's scholarship rather than just about Tolkien's works. So if you have any further questions in that realm, please let me know and I will consider it for a future video. Online Tolkien scholarship is such a new and vibrant place right now, and I am so lucky to get to be just a little tiny part of it. Speaking of being a part of something, if you want to check out my Patreon, that's linked below, but you could also just subscribe if you want to come hang out every single week and hear me talk about nerd stuff. Give this video a like if you enjoyed it and share it with your nerdiest friend. And I just want to say thank you so much for joining me this week, and I hope that you have a very happy, hobbity day.